The Miami courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity as James Wilson pushed through the heavy wooden doors. At 72 years old, his weathered hands gripped a simple manila envelope containing his court summons. The fluorescent lights overhead highlighted the wrinkles on his dark skin and the slight stoop in his shoulders, earned from decades of service that nobody in this building knew about. He wore faded blue overalls, a clean but well-worn white shirt, and scuffed work boots, an intentional choice of clothing that had served him well countless times before. James had learned long ago that sometimes the best disguise was to be exactly what people expected to see. Today, he was just another elderly man heading to traffic court, and that's precisely what he wanted them to think. The young security guard at the metal detector barely glanced at him, waving him through with the dismissive attitude reserved for those deemed unimportant. James noticed everything: the guard's nameplate reading Peterson, the slight bulge of his bulletproof vest, and the way his right hand rested casually near his weapon. Old habits died hard, even after all these years. Making his way to courtroom 3B, James took his time climbing the marble stairs. His slight limp wasn't entirely an act, a souvenir from a mission in Belgrade in '84 that still bothered him on humid days. As he walked, he observed his surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 4 decades noting every detail, every exit, and every face in any room he entered. The wooden benches in the courtroom were already filling up with the morning's cases. Young lawyers in crisp suits hurried past him, their briefcases swinging importantly as they rushed to meet clients. A group of court clerks huddled near the judge's bench, sharing quiet laughs and occasional glances at the gathering crowd. James chose a seat in the middle row, not too far back to appear suspicious, not too close to draw attention. He watched as a young mother struggled with 2 small children a few rows ahead, while a teenager with bright green hair slouched next to him, probably there for a speeding ticket. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 9:00 a.m., and the murmur of conversations grew louder. James could pick out at least 3 different languages being spoken around him: Spanish, Haitian Creole, and what sounded like Russian. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he caught fragments of the Russian conversation, remembering long nights in Moscow when such knowledge had meant the difference between life and death. Judge Patricia Reynolds swept into the courtroom at exactly 9:00 a.m., her black robes billowing behind her. James had done his research, as always. Reynolds, age 52, appointed to the bench 6 years ago, divorced, 2 children in college. Known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for what she considered time wasters. As the bailiff called the court to order, James noticed the way Judge Reynolds surveyed the room, her expression barely concealing her sense of superiority. Her eyes passed over him with the same dismissive glance he received from the security guard, and he saw the slight curl of her lip as she noted his humble appearance. The first few cases moved quickly: speeding tickets, parking violations, minor traffic infractions. James observed how the judge handled each one, noting her tendency to cut off explanations and her barely hidden disdain for those she considered beneath her position. When the bailiff called out case number 247, James Wilson, he slowly rose from his seat. He could feel the impatient stares from those around him as he made his way to the podium, taking each step with deliberate care. A few snickers echoed from the back of the courtroom, and he heard someone whisper, "This should be good." Judge Reynolds peered down at him over her reading glasses, her fingers drumming impatiently on her desk as she glanced at the citation in front of her. "Mr. Wilson, you're here for illegal parking outside a federal building on March 15th at 2:30 p.m. James stood quietly at the podium, his posture straight despite his apparent age, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. To everyone in the courtroom, he appeared to be just another elderly man, probably confused about why he was even there. But behind his calm exterior, James Wilson was already several steps ahead in a game the judge didn't even know they were playing. He had chosen this moment carefully, just as he had chosen countless moments throughout his career. As Judge Reynolds opened her mouth to speak again, her expression already showing signs of amusement, James prepared himself for what would come next. After all, timing had always been everything in his line of work. Judge Reynolds shuffled the papers in front of her, her red-painted fingernails tapping against the wooden bench. The morning sun streaming through the high windows caught the diamonds in her expensive rings, creating tiny prisms of light that danced across her desk. "Mr. Wilson," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, can you explain to the court why you thought it was acceptable to park your vehicle in a restricted area? She emphasized the word restricted, as if speaking to a child, earning a few more snickers from the audience. James stood quietly for a moment, his weathered hands resting lightly on the podium. When he spoke, his voice was soft and slightly trembling, another calculated move that had served him well in the past. Well, you see, Your Honor, I had an important meeting that afternoon. Mr. Wilson, Judge Reynolds interrupted, not even trying to hide her smirk now. Everyone thinks their meeting is important. That's not an excuse to break the law. She glanced at her clerk, sharing a knowing look that made several spectators chuckle. The young prosecutor, eager to score an easy win, jumped in. Your Honor, if I may, the defendant's vehicle was parked in a clearly marked restricted zone for over 2 hours. The signage is quite visible, and ignorance of the law is no excuse. James noticed how the prosecutor's new suit still had the collar stiff with starch, how his shoes were polished but showed scuffs at the heels, signs of someone trying too hard to impress. He'd read people like this in every corner of the world, from Moscow to Baghdad. Son, James said, his voice still soft but carrying a hint of something that made the prosecutor pause. I've been reading signs longer than you've been alive. This earned him a few laughs from the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's sharp gavel. Mr. Wilson, your attitude isn't helping your case, Judge Reynolds scolded. She leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. The fine is $250. Do you have anything else to say before I make my ruling? James could see the judge was ready to move on, to dismiss him as just another elderly man who'd waste the court's time with excuses. He noticed how she'd already started reaching for her gavel, how her clerk was already preparing to call the next case. Actually, Your Honor, James said, reaching slowly into his overall pocket, I do have something to show you. The bailiff tensed slightly, taking a half step forward, but James paid him no mind. He faced down KGB agents with guns. An anxious courthouse bailiff didn't concern him. Judge Reynolds sighed dramatically. Mr. Wilson, if you're going to show me some old parking permit or expired handicap placard, I should warn you that it won't change my ruling. The courtroom had grown quiet now, the usual shuffling and whispers falling silent as James carefully withdrew his worn leather wallet. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, each motion calculated to build tension in the room. Your Honor, he said, his voice suddenly clearer, stronger, losing its previous tremor, I believe this might be relevant to my case. He opened the wallet, the leather creaking slightly in the hushed courtroom. Judge Reynolds rolled her eyes, making a show of her impatience for the audience. Mr. Wilson, we really don't have time for. She stopped mid-sentence as James held up his identification, the gold CIA badge catching the morning sunlight. The silence in the courtroom deepened. James could hear the soft whir of the ceiling fan, the distant sound of traffic outside, the sharp intake of breath from the prosecutor. He kept his eyes fixed on Judge Reynolds, watching as the color slowly drained from her face. The badge wasn't just any CIA identification. It was a senior intelligence service badge, the kind that opened doors in every federal building in the country, the kind that made generals stand up straight and politicians choose their words carefully. Judge Reynolds's hand, which had been reaching for her gavel, froze in midair. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she struggled to process what she was seeing. The smirk that had been present on her face throughout the proceedings vanished, replaced by a look of growing realization and horror. The morning's entertainment had suddenly taken an unexpected turn, and everyone in courtroom 3B knew it. As James Wilson stood calmly at the podium, still holding his badge, he allowed himself a small internal smile. The real show was about to begin. The silence in the courtroom hung heavy as Judge Reynolds struggled to find her voice. Her fingers, which had been so confidently drumming on her desk moments ago, now trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. The CIA badge in James's hand seemed to command all the attention in the room, its golden surface still catching the morning light. I see, Judge Reynolds finally managed, her voice having lost its previous condescending tone. Mr. Wilson, perhaps you could explain the circumstances of your parking situation. The change in her demeanor was dramatic. Gone was the patronizing smile, replaced by an expression of careful neutrality. James slowly returned his badge to his wallet, taking his time as all eyes in the courtroom remained fixed on him. The young prosecutor had sunk back into his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. The spectators who had been snickering earlier now sat in rapt attention, their phones forgotten in their laps. As I was saying, Your Honor, James began, his voice now clear and authoritative. I had an important meeting that afternoon, a meeting concerning matters of national security with active field agents. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. The regular parking spaces were full, and given the sensitive nature of our discussion, I couldn't exactly circle the block looking for a spot. Judge Reynolds nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. Of course, of course. That's completely understandable, Mr. Wilson. She shuffled her papers nervously, avoiding direct eye contact with the man she had been mocking just minutes before. But James wasn't finished. He stood straighter now, his apparent frailty falling away like an old coat. I've served this country for 40 years, Your Honor. I've operated in places where parking tickets were the least of my concerns. His voice carried the weight of countless classified missions and untold stories that would never see the light of day. The bailiff, who had been tensely watching earlier, now stood at ease, showing the natural respect of one government servant for another. Even the court clerk had stopped her usual typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she listened. During my career, James continued, I've learned that appearances can be deceiving. It's a lesson that saved my life more times than I can count. His eyes met Judge Reynolds's directly, and she found she couldn't look away. Sometimes, Your Honor, the old man in overalls might be the most important person in the room. A few murmurs of approval rippled through the courtroom. The young mother who had been struggling with her children earlier was now sitting perfectly still, her eyes wide. The teenager with green hair had straightened up in his seat, all traces of boredom gone from his face. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat, her cheeks flushing red with embarrassment. Mr. Wilson, I feel I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was inappropriate. She glanced around the courtroom, aware that her previous actions had not gone unnoticed by the gathered crowd. James nodded slightly but remained silent, allowing the judge to continue. Her discomfort was palpable as she searched for the right words to address the situation she had created. Your parking citation is dismissed, of course, she said quickly. And I want to thank you for your service to our country. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, a weak attempt to recover from her earlier behavior. But James wasn't done teaching his lesson. With the same quiet dignity that had carried him through decades of clandestine operations, he spoke again. Your Honor, if I may say one more thing? He waited for her nod before continuing. In my line of work, making quick judgments about people can get you killed. In your line of work, it can kill justice. The impact of his words was visible on Judge Reynolds's face. She sat back in her chair, the full weight of the morning's events finally settling on her shoulders. The courtroom remained silent, every person present understanding that they were witnessing something significant. James then did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a smile of triumph or vindication, but a gentle, understanding smile that somehow made the situation even more poignant. We all have our learning moments, Your Honor. The question is what we do with them. The tension in courtroom 3B shifted as James's words hung in the air. Judge Reynolds's hands fidgeted with her gavel, a nervous habit she hadn't displayed since her first days on the bench. The morning sun had moved higher now, casting long shadows across the wooden floor and highlighting the dust particles dancing in the air. Mr. Wilson, Judge Reynolds began, her voice carrying a new note of respect, would you be willing to share any of your experiences with the court? That is, anything that isn't classified. She added the last part quickly, aware that she was now dealing with someone whose life had been dedicated to keeping secrets. James considered her request carefully, his eyes scanning the faces in the courtroom. He saw genuine interest now where there had been mockery before. The young prosecutor had pulled out a notepad, pen poised eagerly over the paper. There was a time in Prague, James began, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, when I was dressed much like I am today. The year was 1985, and the Cold War was anything but cold. He adjusted his position slightly, easing the weight off his bad leg. The courtroom leaned forward collectively, even the bailiff moving closer to hear better. Judge Reynolds had completely abandoned her usual stern demeanor, sitting forward in her chair like an eager student. I was posing as a maintenance worker in a government building, James continued. The guard at the desk treated me exactly as most people in this courtroom treated me today, with dismissal and derision. He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That guard's mistake allowed me to access files that ultimately prevented a major international incident. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. The young mother in the audience nodded unconsciously, while her children sat unusually still, captivated by James's presence. The teenager with green hair had pulled out his phone, but instead of texting, he was taking notes. "Your Honor," James said, turning his attention back to the judge, "I've spent my life being invisible when I needed to be, and visible when it mattered. I've sat in rooms with presidents and kings, dressed in suits worth more than cars. I've also crawled through sewers in clothes like these, gathering intelligence that saved American lives." Judge Reynolds swallowed hard, the implications of his words clear. Her earlier behavior now seemed even more shameful in light of his revelations. "The parking ticket that brought me here today," James continued. "I received it while meeting with 2 active agents who are tracking a domestic threat. We chose that federal building because it would draw the least attention. The restricted parking space I used provided the quickest access to a secure entrance." The prosecutor, who had been scribbling furiously, suddenly stopped and looked up, realization dawning on his face. The secure entrance James mentioned was known to only a handful of government officials. "Those 2 hours I spent illegally parked," James said, his voice taking on a slight edge, "were spent reviewing intelligence that could prevent an attack on American soil. Sometimes, Your Honor, following the letter of the law must be balanced against serving the spirit of justice." The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Judge Reynolds' face showed a mix of emotions: embarrassment at her earlier behavior, respect for the man before her, and something else: understanding. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice carrying a new humility, "I believe you have taught this court more in the past few minutes than any legal textbook could convey." She straightened in her chair, seeming to come to a decision. "Would you be willing to speak to our judicial training program? Your perspective on judgment and appearances would be invaluable." James nodded slowly, but before he could respond, a man in a dark suit appeared at the courtroom door. He made a subtle gesture that only James seemed to notice. The older man's posture changed slightly, a change so minimal that only those trained in covert operations would have caught it. "I apologize, Your Honor," James said, his voice returning to its earlier soft tone, "but duty calls." He turned slightly toward the door, then back to the judge. "However, before I go, there's one more thing you should know." The man in the dark suit remained motionless at the doorway as James turned back to face Judge Reynolds. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations had ceased completely. "Your Honor," James said, reaching into his overall pocket once more, "there's something else you should see." This time, he pulled out a thin manila folder, its edges worn but the contents clearly well preserved. The bailiff, having learned his lesson from earlier, didn't even flinch. Judge Reynolds straightened in her chair, her curiosity evident. "Please proceed, Mr. Wilson." James opened the folder carefully, removing a black and white photograph. This was taken in 1983 at the federal courthouse in Boston. He held up the photo so the judge could see it. "The young law clerk in this picture, the one standing next to Judge Harrison. That's you, isn't it, Your Honor?" The color drained from Judge Reynolds' face as she recognized herself in the photograph, younger, eager, standing proudly next to one of the most respected federal judges of that era. But more than that, she recognized the elderly janitor in the background of the photo, barely visible in the corner. "That was you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. James nodded slowly. "I was tracking a Soviet operative who had infiltrated the federal court system. Judge Harrison's clerk, not you, but another one, was passing classified information to foreign agents." He paused, letting the information sink in. "You were almost dragged into it, but you refused to deliver certain documents without proper authorization. Your instincts probably saved your career, though you never knew it at the time." The prosecutor's pen had stopped moving, his mouth slightly open as he listened. The spectators in the courtroom were completely still, absorbed in this unexpected revelation. "For 3 months, I mopped those floors, emptied those trash cans, and gathered the evidence we needed," James continued. "Judge Harrison never knew. The other clerks never knew. But you," he smiled slightly, "you were the only one who ever said thank you when I cleaned your office." Judge Reynolds's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. I remember that time. There was a scandal, a clerk was arrested, but the details were never made public. No, they weren't, James confirmed. The operation was classified. Still is, technically, but enough time has passed that I can share this much. He glanced at the man in the dark suit, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. That case, James continued, taught me something valuable about the justice system. It's not just about the judges, the lawyers, or the laws. It's about every person in the building, from the highest judge to the person cleaning the floors. Each one has a role to play in maintaining justice. The young mother in the audience wiped a tear from her eye. The teenager had stopped taking notes, simply staring in awe. Even the court clerk had abandoned any pretense of working, completely engrossed in the unfolding story. Your Honor, James said, his voice gentle but firm. 42 years ago, you were that young clerk who showed kindness to a janitor. Today, you're a judge who nearly let prejudice cloud your judgment of an old man in overalls. The question is, which person do you want to be moving forward? Judge Reynolds removed her glasses, wiping her eyes with a tissue. The courtroom remained silent as she composed herself, the weight of James's words settling over everyone present. The man in the dark suit shifted slightly, a subtle reminder that time was running short. James carefully returned the photograph to its folder, but before he could turn to leave, Judge Reynolds spoke again. Mr. Wilson, she said, her voice stronger now, filled with determination, thank you for reminding me of who I once was, and who I should still be. James nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. But as he prepared to leave, the door to the courtroom opened again, and another figure appeared behind the man in the dark suit. This new arrival caused James's expression to change subtly, indicating that the morning's surprises weren't quite over yet. The new arrival was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. As he entered the courtroom, the man in the dark suit stepped aside respectfully. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience as several people recognized him. Director Thomas Mitchell of the CIA. Judge Reynolds immediately rose to her feet, protocol momentarily forgotten in her surprise. Director Mitchell, this is an unexpected honor. Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and concern, wondering what could have brought the CIA director himself to her courtroom. The director's presence commanded attention, but his eyes were fixed solely on James. Wilson, he said, his voice carrying both warmth and authority, I thought I might find you here. He walked forward, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. James straightened slightly, though his demeanor remained calm. Tom, he acknowledged with a slight nod, the familiar address causing several gasps in the courtroom. I didn't expect you to come personally. Director Mitchell smiled, a gesture that softened his official demeanor. How could I not? When I heard one of our most decorated officers was dealing with a parking ticket, I had to see it for myself. He turned to address Judge Reynolds. Your Honor, I apologize for interrupting your court proceedings, but I believe you should know exactly who has been standing before you today. The judge sank back into her chair, sensing that another revelation was coming. The young prosecutor had given up any pretense of maintaining his professional composure and was openly staring. James Wilson, Director Mitchell began, has served this country for over 4 decades. He was instrumental in preventing 3 major terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, operations so classified that even most CIA agents don't know about them. He paused, glancing at James, who remained characteristically modest. He saved more American lives than we can count, and he's never sought recognition for any of it. The teenager with green hair had stopped trying to look cool and was recording every word on his phone. The young mother held her children closer, understanding that they were witnessing a piece of hidden history. In fact, the director continued, James was supposed to receive the Intelligence Cross today, our highest honor. But instead of attending the private ceremony at Langley, he chose to be here, following up on intelligence about a potential threat to our federal buildings. Judge Reynolds's face showed a new wave of embarrassment as she realized she had nearly fined a man who was supposed to be receiving the CIA's highest award. The parking ticket, James finally spoke, his voice carrying its earlier gentle tone, was a necessary inconvenience. The meeting I attended revealed crucial information about a security vulnerability in federal courthouse parking structures nationwide. He looked directly at Judge Reynolds. Sometimes, Your Honor, Breaking a small rule can help uphold the larger laws that keep our nation safe. Director Mitchell nodded approvingly. And that's why we still meet him in the field. Even after all these years, James sees things others miss. His ability to blend in, to be underestimated. He gestured at the overalls James wore. It saved more lives than any high-tech surveillance system we've ever developed. The courtroom had fallen into a reverent silence. The bailiff stood at attention, showing the respect due to both the CIA director and the unassuming hero before him. Judge Reynolds found her voice again. Director Mitchell, Mr. Wilson, I don't know what to say except that I am deeply ashamed of my earlier behavior and profoundly grateful for your service. She looked around her courtroom at the faces of every person present. I believe we've all learned an invaluable lesson today about judgment and appearances. Director Mitchell stepped closer to James. We still have that ceremony waiting, old friend. The Secretary of State is holding the proceedings for you. James nodded, but before turning to leave, he addressed the courtroom one final time. Your Honor, everyone here today has sworn to uphold justice in their own way, whether as judges, lawyers, or court staff. Remember that justice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a badge. Sometimes it comes in overalls, with a limp and a story that can never be fully told. As James and Director Mitchell prepared to leave, Judge Reynolds stood once more, this time with genuine respect in her bearing. But there was still one more surprise left, a revelation that would leave the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Just as James and Director Mitchell reached the courtroom doors, commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Two more men in dark suits burst through the doors, their faces tense with urgency. They quickly approached Director Mitchell, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The director's expression changed immediately, his earlier warmth replaced by grave concern. He turned to James, who had already straightened his posture, reading the situation with decades of experience. It's happening now, Director Mitchell said quietly, but his words carried across the silent courtroom. The threat you uncovered. They're moving earlier than we anticipated. Judge Reynolds gripped her desk, suddenly understanding that she was witnessing more than just an extraordinary court proceeding. The bailiff instinctively moved closer to the judge's bench, while the young prosecutor gathered his papers with trembling hands. James didn't hesitate. With surprising agility for his apparent age, he shed his overalls in one smooth motion, revealing a tactical vest and equipment underneath. The transformation was stunning. The elderly man in worn clothes had vanished, replaced by a seasoned operative ready for action. The parking structures? James asked, his voice now crisp and professional. Director Mitchell nodded grimly. 3 courthouses, Miami, Atlanta, and Chicago. Our teams are en route, but you're already here. He left the implications hanging in the air. Judge Reynolds stood up. Director Mitchell, should we evacuate the building? No, Your Honor, James answered before the director could speak. An evacuation is exactly what they're waiting for. They want chaos, people streaming into the streets. He turned to Director Mitchell. Tom, give me Anderson and Chen. We can handle this quietly. The director nodded to the 2 agents who had just arrived. They immediately moved to flank James, their poses matching his readiness. The courthouse's own security personnel had arrived at the doors, but stayed back at a signal from the director. Your Honor, James addressed Judge Reynolds one last time. I need you to continue court proceedings as normal. Any disruption could alert them that we know. His voice carried the weight of command, and the judge found herself nodding in agreement. The young mother in the audience clutched her children closer, while the teenager with green hair sat frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand. The court clerk had stopped typing entirely, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. James turned to the spectators, his voice calm but authoritative. Everyone in this room is now part of an ongoing national security operation. Continue your normal activities. What happens next depends on your ability to remain calm and act natural. Director Mitchell added, What you've witnessed in this courtroom falls under national security classification. You'll be briefed on your obligations after this situation is resolved. James checked his equipment with practiced efficiency. The parking garage connects to the building's main support structures. They'll have someone monitoring the security feeds. We'll need to move through the blind spots. The 2 agents with him nodded, already synchronizing their communications equipment. The transformation of the courtroom from a place of legal proceedings to the command center of a covered operation was surreal but seamless. Judge Reynolds, showing remarkable composure, picked up her gavel. We'll continue with the day's cases. She looked at James with new understanding. Good luck, Mr. Wilson. James gave her a slight nod, then turned to Director Mitchell. Give us 30 minutes. If you don't hear from us by then, initiate Protocol 7. The director's face tightened at the mention of Protocol 7, but he nodded. Just like Budapest in 91? Let's hope it goes better than Budapest. James replied with a grim smile. He turned to his team, speaking in low tones that didn't carry to the spectators. As the three agents prepared to leave, James paused for a moment. He looked back at the courtroom, at the faces of everyone who had witnessed this extraordinary turn of events. His eyes met Judge Reynolds' one last time. Remember, Your Honor, he said quietly, justice comes in many forms. Today, it wears a tactical vest. With those words, James and his team slipped out of the courtroom, moving with the silent efficiency that had made them legends in the intelligence community. Director Mitchell remained behind, his presence ensuring the courtroom would maintain its calm facade while history unfolded in the parking structure below. The day's greatest revelation, however, was still to come, one that would change everything they thought they knew about James Wilson. 45 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened quietly. James Wilson walked in, his tactical vest showing signs of a struggle, but his composure intact. Behind him, his team led three handcuffed men in maintenance uniforms, their faces showing defeat. Director Mitchell immediately stood, relief visible on his face. Status: threat neutralized, James reported calmly. The devices have been secured. No casualties. He spoke as if discussing the weather, not a potentially catastrophic attack that had just been prevented. Judge Reynolds called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom began to clear, Director Mitchell stepped forward with a heavy manila envelope in his hands. I think now is the appropriate time, James. The remaining spectators watched as the director pulled out a document, its official seals gleaming under the courtroom lights. This was supposed to be presented at Langley today, but here seems more fitting. James stood quietly as Mitchell began to read. In recognition of unprecedented service spanning 5 decades, the President of the United States hereby acknowledges the retirement of Senior Intelligence Officer James Wilson. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Retirement? After what they just witnessed. But Mitchell wasn't finished. Furthermore, it is my privilege to reveal that Officer Wilson has served as the inspiration and architect for our entire undercover senior agent program, codenamed the Gray Initiative. The young prosecutor's jaw dropped. The Gray Initiative was legendary in law enforcement circles, a program that utilized elderly agents to gather intelligence in plain sight, capitalizing on society's tendency to overlook seniors. James didn't just participate in the program, Mitchell continued, he created it. After noticing how often he was ignored or dismissed due to his age, he proposed training older agents specifically for undercover work. The program has become our most successful covert operations strategy. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. How many others are there? That's classified, James answered with a small smile. But let's just say that in every major city, in government buildings, parks, and shopping centers, there are guardians that nobody notices. Veterans who chose to continue serving their country in the most invisible way possible. The teenager with green hair finally found his voice. So there are secret agent grandpas everywhere. James chuckled. And grandmas. Some of our best operators are women in their 70s. Who suspects the little old lady feeding pigeons in the park? Director Mitchell placed a hand on James's shoulder. James is retiring today not just as an agent, but as the father of modern Gray operations. His methods will be taught at Langley for generations to come. The young mother who had been present all morning stood up, her children beside her. Mr. Wilson, she said softly, I'm a federal prosecutor in Detroit. Would you consider coming to speak to our office? We need to hear what you have to teach. James looked at her thoughtfully. That's actually my next chapter. Training the next generation to look past appearances, to see what others miss. He turned to Judge Reynolds. Starting with a series of seminars for the judicial system, if you're still interested, Your Honor. The judge nodded emphatically. More than ever. Director Mitchell cleared his throat. There's one last thing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. The president asked me to deliver this personally. Inside was the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. As Mitchell pinned it to James's chest, the entire courtroom stood in spontaneous respect. James looked at the medal, then at the faces around him, the judge who had learned to see beyond appearances, the teenager who now understood that heroes come in all ages, the young mother teaching her children an unexpected lesson about judgment and service. The greatest weapon in intelligence, James said quietly, isn't technology or weapons or even information. It's invisibility. Not the kind you get from fancy gadgets, but the kind that comes from being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. He touched the medal gently. Remember that the next time you see an old man in overalls or a grandmother on a park bench, they might just be guardian angels in disguise. As the courtroom buzzed with conversation, James Wilson straightened his jacket and prepared to leave, ready to begin his new chapter of teaching others what he had learned in a lifetime of invisible service. Behind him, Judge Reynolds picked up her gavel, forever changed by the day an elderly man in overalls had taught her courtroom the true meaning of justice and judgment. The end.